The dim lighting of Ann-Margret's Beverly Hills home cast long shadows across her living room as she carefully removed a small key from around her neck. At 80 years old, her hands showed signs of age, but they moved with deliberate grace as she unlocked the antique cherrywood box that had traveled with her for decades. The Swedish-born actress, once dubbed the female Elvis by the press, had maintained her poise and privacy throughout her legendary career. But tonight was different. Tonight she had finally decided to reveal what she had kept hidden for half a century. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked the young journalist sitting across from her, voice recorder placed carefully on the coffee table between them. Ann-Margret's eyes, still captivating despite the years, flickered briefly with uncertainty before hardening with resolve. "It's time," she said simply, "before there's no one left to tell the truth." From the box she withdrew a small red leather diary, its edges worn soft from handling. Its once bright color faded to a deep burgundy. A gold lock, now tarnished with age, hung broken at its side. She handled it as one might a sacred relic, with reverence and care. "I started keeping this diary in 1963. During the filming of Viva Las Vegas," she explained. "The day I met Elvis." The journalist leaned forward slightly. Ann-Margret rarely spoke about Elvis Presley in interviews. Their relationship, whatever it had truly been, had remained largely a mystery despite decades of speculation. The official narrative was simple enough, a brief on-set romance during their film together, nothing more than a Hollywood fling that ended when Elvis returned to Priscilla. "May I?" the journalist asked, gesturing to the diary. Ann-Margret's fingers tightened momentarily around the small book. "Not yet. First, you need to understand how it all began, how it really began." Las Vegas, July 1963. The desert heat was oppressive, the air conditioning in the studio barely making a dent as cameras were set up for the first day of filming. Ann-Margret stood nervously in her dressing room, reviewing her lines. At 22, she was already being hailed as one of Hollywood's most promising talents after her breakout role in Bye Bye Birdie. But today she would be meeting Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley, and her stomach was in knots. There was a knock at her door. Expecting the makeup artist, she called, "Come in." Instead, Elvis Presley himself stood in her doorway, dressed in a simple black shirt and pants. Rather than his character's wardrobe, he seemed almost ordinary for a moment, until he smiled. "Miss Ann-Margret," he said in that famous Tennessee drawl, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Mr. Presley," she replied, suddenly conscious of her casual attire and lack of makeup. "Please, just Elvis," he said, extending his hand. The moment their hands touched, Ann-Margret would later write in her diary, "Something electric happened, like a current passing between us. I've never believed in love at first sight. But this wasn't love, it was recognition." What followed was a romance that blazed across the Las Vegas sets and casino backrooms, hidden in plain sight from everyone except those closest to the production. Their chemistry was undeniable on camera, their director George Sidney often commenting that he barely needed to direct their scenes together. They moved as if they had known each other for years, not days. "We were mirror images," Ann-Margret explained to the journalist, her gaze distant as she recalled those early days, both raised in small towns by strict parents, both deeply connected to music, both shy and private but alive on stage. She smiled slightly. "He called me Rusty, my character's name, even when the cameras weren't rolling. But their connection went beyond shared backgrounds. In her diary she had written, August 3, 1963, "Told me tonight that I'm the first woman he's met who understands the pressure, who knows what it's like to have everyone want a piece of you, to never really be off stage. With me," he says, "he can breathe, can just be Elvis the man, not Elvis the king." What neither the diary nor Ann-Margret mentioned to the journalist was what both of them knew hung over their relationship like a shadow. Priscilla Beaulieu, waiting back in Memphis, Elvis's girlfriend since she was 14, now 18, and expecting him to fulfill his promise of marriage. "Did you know about Priscilla from the beginning?" the journalist asked. Ann-Margret's expression didn't change. "Of course, everyone knew about Priscilla." "Then how?" "You've never been in love, have you?" Ann-Margret interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "The kind that feels inevitable, like gravity. The kind you don't choose." As filming continued through the summer of 1963, Elvis and Ann-Margret became increasingly inseparable. They rode motorcycles through the desert at dawn, sang together at the piano after filming Wrapped, and spent nights talking until sunrise. The studio publicists were ecstatic about their chemistry, arranging photo ops and interviews that played up their connection. It was perfect publicity for the film, until it wasn't. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's controlling manager, began to worry. He had carefully cultivated Elvis's image, and that image included his eventual marriage to Priscilla. A serious relationship with Ann-Margret wasn't part of the plan. Warnings were issued, first subtle, then explicit. September 21st, 1963. Ann-Margret read from her diary. E was upset today after a call from the colonel. Said things are complicated. I told him I understand. But do I? Can I bear being a secret? The other woman? This isn't who I am. But when we're together, nothing else seems to matter. As filming wrapped, they made promises to stay connected. Elvis returned to Memphis, to Graceland, to Priscilla. Ann-Margret embarked on a promotional tour for Bye Bye Birdie, but phone calls crossed the country late at night, and whenever their paths could possibly cross, a show in Vegas, a weekend in Los Angeles, they found their way back to each other. It wasn't just physical, Ann-Margret told the journalist, though that's what everyone assumed, what everyone wrote about. It was deeper. He showed me his poetry. I taught him Swedish lullabies. We talked about God, about feeling trapped by our own success, things neither of us could discuss with anyone else. But paradise couldn't last. In early 1964, a Hollywood gossip columnist published a piece strongly suggesting that Elvis and Ann-Margret were secretly engaged. The article reached Graceland and Priscilla like a bomb. Elvis called Ann-Margret in a panic. The colonel was furious. Priscilla was devastated. He had to end things immediately and publicly. There would be a statement. Their relationship was purely professional. Rumors of romance were completely fabricated. February 13, 1964, Ann-Margret read, her voice growing softer. It's over. Just like that. E called, his voice cold, distant. Said the colonel was issuing a statement, that we needed to cool it completely. No calls, no meetings, nothing. Asked if I understood. What could I say? That I'm heartbroken? That I'm angry? I just said yes, I understand. Then he hesitated, his voice changing, becoming his own again. Rusty, he said, this isn't what I want. I couldn't bear to hear more, so I hung up. The journalist sat in silence, taking in the story so far. It aligned with what was publicly known. A brief affair during filming ended before Elvis returned fully to Priscilla. But something in Ann-Margret's demeanor suggested there was more, much more. That's the story everyone knows, the journalist said carefully. A film fling that ended when reality intruded. Ann-Margret smiled, a knowing, almost secretive smile. Yes, that's the story everyone knows. She ran her fingers over the diary's cover. But it's not the whole story. Not even close. She opened the diary to a ribbon marker placed nearly halfway through. April 25, 1964. Got a strange call today. Not from E directly, but from Joe, his friend. Said E wanted to meet privately. No one can know. Said it's urgent. I should have said no. Instead I said when and where. The meeting took place in a private bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where Elvis had taken up temporary residence while working on another film. Ann-Margret arrived disguised in a headscarf and large sunglasses, her heart hammering as she slipped past the lobby and directly to the private entrance at the back. When Elvis opened the door, she was shocked by his appearance. He seemed exhausted, his famous face drawn and pale. I had to see you, he said simply, pulling her inside. For hours they talked, really talked. Elvis confessed that he felt trapped by the colonel's control, by his promise to Priscilla, by the golden cage of his fame. Ann-Margret shared her fears of being typecast, of being valued only for her looks rather than her talent. They spoke of their dreams, their regrets, their futures. And then Elvis did something neither of them expected. He pulled out a small blue box. He'd had it made specially. Ann-Margret told the journalist, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. A ruby surrounded by diamonds. Not an engagement ring, he was careful to say. A promise. A promise of what? The journalist asked. That what we had was real. That no matter what happened next, no matter who they publicly became, they would always have this connection. That one day when the time was right, she trailed off. Did you accept it? Ann-Margret nodded slowly. I did. Foolish, perhaps. We both knew he still had obligations to Priscilla, but in that moment, it felt like we were making a pact beyond the constraints of our public lives. The ring remained their secret, worn by Ann-Margret only in private. They continued to meet clandestinely throughout 1964, always careful, always aware of the risks. Elvis would call from payphones, send messages through trusted friends, arrange elaborate schemes to see her without alerting the press or the colonel. It was exhausting, Ann-Margret admitted. Living a double life. But we were young and in love and convinced we were the only ones who understood each other. Then came the letter. In late 1964, Elvis wrote Ann-Margret what would become the most consequential document of their relationship. Pages of his innermost thoughts, his frustrations with the colonel, his doubts about marrying Priscilla, despite his sense of obligation, and his feelings for Ann-Margret. I've never let anyone read the full letter, Ann-Margret said, turning to the back of the diary where an envelope was affixed to the inside cover. And I won't now. Some things should remain private, even after all these years. But she did reveal that in the letter, Elvis had proposed a plan. He would fulfill his obligation to Priscilla with a marriage that he expected would eventually end, while he and Ann-Margret would maintain their connection privately. In a few years, when the timing was right, they could finally be together openly. It sounds calculating now, Ann-Margret acknowledged. Cruel even, but you have to understand the pressure Elvis was under. The colonel had convinced him that breaking things off with Priscilla would destroy his image, his career, and Priscilla had given up her entire life, moved to Graceland with the promise of marriage. He felt trapped, and this was the only way he could see forward. Ann-Margret's response to this proposal was never sent. Before she could reply, catastrophe struck. While Elvis was away on location, Priscilla had been searching through his personal items at Graceland, something she later admitted to doing regularly out of insecurity about their relationship. In the pocket of a suit jacket, she found half of Elvis's letter to Ann-Margret. The other half had apparently been torn away, but what remained was enough: expressions of deep love, doubts about his future with Priscilla, and hints of a plan for the future. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Priscilla threatened to leave, to tell her story to the press. The colonel quickly intervened, convincing Elvis that his only option was to completely cut ties with Ann-Margret and commit fully to Priscilla. An ultimatum was issued: end things permanently with Ann-Margret, or watch his career implode. December 1964, Ann-Margret read from her diary. It's truly over this time. I called, his voice strange, mechanical. Said P, found part of his letter. Said we can never have contact again. Not ever. I asked about our promise. He hung up without answering. I'm not sure which hurts more, losing him or realizing how easily he gave in to their demands. The journalist sat in stunned silence. This part of the story had never been made public. The torn letter, they finally managed. That's what you mentioned at the beginning. Priscilla found half, and you kept half? Ann-Margret nodded, carefully extracting a yellowed piece of paper from the envelope in the back of the diary. The last page, the part she never saw. On it, in Elvis's distinctive handwriting, were the final lines of his letter to Ann-Margret. Whatever happens, know this: you are the love of my life. The one who sees the real me. If fate keeps us apart, I'll understand. But I'll be watching for you, always. And if you ever hear Fools Rush In being played, know that I'm thinking of you, Rusty. That hasn't changed. That won't ever change. Forever, E. He married Priscilla in 1967, the journalist said softly. Yes, Ann-Margret confirmed. And I married Roger in 1967. We both did what was expected of us. But the story doesn't end there, does it? The journalist pressed, sensing there was more. Ann-Margret's smile was sad. Stories like ours don't have neat endings. What followed was a revelation that contradicted decades of carefully constructed narratives. Despite the public split in their respective marriages, Elvis and Ann-Margret had maintained a connection throughout the rest of Elvis's life. Not a physical affair. Ann-Margret was adamant about that. She respected her marriage to Roger Smith too much, but an emotional bond that never fully broke. When Ann-Margret performed in Las Vegas, Elvis would send flowers to her dressing room. Always the same arrangement, always with the same card, from EP. When she suffered a serious fall during a performance in 1972, Elvis called her while she was in the hospital, despite the Colonel's continued disapproval of any contact. And most surprisingly, in the months before his death in 1977, Elvis had reached out more frequently. He was unhappy, Ann-Margret revealed, divorced from Priscilla, struggling with his health, feeling creatively stifled. He called late at night, sometimes just to hear my voice, sometimes he couldn't even speak, but I knew it was him. Their final conversation took place just a week before his death. Elvis had called from Graceland, sounding more clear-headed than he had in months. August 9, 1977. Ann-Margret read from the final pages of her diary. Margret called tonight. Talked about starting fresh, making changes, firing the Colonel, recording the kind of music he wants to make. Said he's been thinking about what might have been a lot lately. Asked if I ever think about it too. I said yes, sometimes, he said. We'll always have Vegas, won't we, Rusty? Then he had to go. Said he'd call again soon. He never did. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead at Graceland. Ann-Margret closed the diary gently. I attended his funeral, stood in the back. The only former co-star who came. The official statement was that we hadn't spoken in years, that our brief romance was ancient history, nothing more than a footnote. It was easier that way, for everyone. But you kept the ring, the journalist observed, and the diary, and his letter. Some bonds can't be broken by public statements or the passage of time. Ann-Margret replied simply. Some connections defy explanation. Why tell this story now, after all these years? Ann-Margret was quiet for a moment. Because history should be accurate. Because I'm tired of reading simplified accounts that reduce what we had to a brief fling on a movie set. Because I'm one of the last people alive who knew the real Elvis, not the caricature he became. She carefully returned the diary to its cherrywood box. I'm not trying to hurt anyone or tarnish memories. Priscilla loved him too, in her way. She suffered, as we all did, from loving a man who wasn't fully free to love in return. A man who belonged in some sense to the world more than to any one person. Do you regret it? The journalist asked. Any of it? Ann-Margret's smile was genuine this time. How could I? Even with the pain, even with the secrets, even with the years of wondering what if, I wouldn't trade having known the real Elvis, having been truly seen by him, for anything. As the interview concluded and the journalist prepared to leave, Ann-Margret had one final revelation. From the pocket of her blouse, she withdrew a small blue velvet box. Inside was the ruby and diamond ring, maintained in perfect condition despite the decades. I've never worn it in public, she said. Never showed it to anyone. Not even Roger knew about it. But it's been with me every day since Elvis gave it to me. She snapped the box closed and returned it to her pocket. Some loves aren't meant to be fulfilled in the conventional sense. Some burn briefly, but leave a mark that lasts forever. That's what Elvis and I had. Not a happily ever after, but a connection that transcended circumstance and time. The journalist left Ann-Margret's home with the weight of history in their hands. A story that would rewrite the narrative of one of music's greatest icons and one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. A story of love constrained by fame, of promises kept despite impossible odds, of a bond that survived marriages, careers, and even death. And as they drove away, they could have sworn they heard Fools Rush In, playing faintly from somewhere inside the house, Elvis's voice crooning the ballad across time, a message still being received after all these years. In the days that followed the publication of the interview, cultural historians and Elvis experts debated the revelations. Some dismissed Ann-Margret's account as the romanticized memories of an aging star. Others found evidence that supported her claims. Flowers ordered consistently to Las Vegas venues during her performances, phone records from Graceland showing calls to her home in the months before Elvis's death, and most compelling, a ruby and diamond ring listed in Elvis's personal jewelry inventory in 1964, later noted as missing. Priscilla Presley initially declined to comment. Then, a week after the story broke, she held a brief press conference. Standing poised before the cameras, her face betrayed little emotion as she made a simple statement. Elvis's life was complex. His heart was large. There was room in it for many people. I've made my peace with that long ago. Perhaps the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source. A former member of Elvis's entourage, one of the few still living, confirmed that Elvis had indeed spoken of Ann-Margret often throughout his life. Even in his final years, when memories sometimes got jumbled, he never confused his feelings for her, the man stated. He'd sometimes say, "Rusty was the one who got away, the one who knew me before all the noise got too loud." In her final years, Ann-Margret would occasionally be asked about Elvis in interviews. Her response became consistent. A gentle smile, a simple acknowledgement of their special friendship, and a deflection to discussions of her extensive career. But those who knew her well noted that she continued to wear a small sapphire pendant that had not been part of her jewelry collection before the revelations, a pendant that matched exactly the blue of Elvis's eyes. The true depth of Elvis and Ann-Margret's relationship might never be fully understood by the public. Some bonds exist in spaces beyond words, beyond explanations, but in bringing her diary into the light after 50 years, Ann-Margret had ensured one thing: history would no longer simplify what had been profound, no longer dismiss as fleeting what had endured for a lifetime. And somewhere, perhaps, Elvis was smiling. His Rusty had kept her promise after all.